All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining. We're starting just a minute earlier here because we have some fantastic speakers and great content, and we want to make sure we get through them in the next 6 hours. Kidding, obviously the 1 hour for everyone. Tonight's webinar is Condo Living, 3 sides to every story. Essentially what we're looking to do is to give people a behind the curtain look on the 3 different key roles that directors, the legal team, and the property manager team give to the board and to the ownership within each community of a condo. So without further ado, I'm going to get started on some great introductions here. First foremost, myself, Mike Lewicki. I have the pleasure of currently serving as a director on CCI-EO. As does in the background, you'll see another moderator as well, Shelley Seeby with CMG. She is currently the manager in charge of the compliance department over at CMG. Jim Davidson, who many of you know from our Lawyers, Guns and Money, our annual event in January. Jim has been practicing condominium law and a member of CCI for 36 years, just around the 36-year mark. He also has the distinction of holding an ACCI and an FCCI through CCI, 2 of our original designations for professional and other members. And of course, Constance, many of you know from our director's courses and our other events we have pre-COVID. Constance has been a director with CCI-EO since at least 2006, is a past president of the chapter and the current vice president of the chapter. She also is our national rep for CCI National, as well as participating in the Condo Strength as her liaison, and she's the newest addition to a regular column in our newsletter regarding national issues for condos. On top of that, when she has a free moment, she also happens to be a director on 2 condo boards, one low-rise, one high-rise, going back as far as 15 years, and she serves as president on both of those boards. In her free time, which I think is looking like in 2037, she enjoys gardening. Actually, I don't know that. I just know that Constance is quite involved in our condo, so we're quite happy to have her join us from a director perspective this evening. And of course, for some of you who don't know, one of our Kingston team members here is Michael Trindota, and he is with a property management firm at Winnington Communities. I believe I may have butchered that, Mike. I'll let you correct that. They've been a member for about 3 years with CCI, but they've been practicing and actively engaged in property management of condominiums for 7 years. So it's great to have somebody from a further point of our chapter to bring in their perspective and their opinions on how we need to work with ownership and community. So this is fantastic. So I'd also like to just take one more moment to thank our 2 sponsors. Ellie & Associates are condominium lawyers who you've seen at many events. They're a member of many different chapters. We're happy and honored to have them as sponsor. And of course, Condominium Financial, which of course is always nice to have when we have concerns with reserve funds, finance, or things like that. They're a great resource. So at this point, I'm going to put myself on mute. I'm going to turn it over to Constance, and she'll be going through the first level, and then we'll move on to Michael from Property Management and round off the evening with Jim. At the end of each of the sessions, we'll have a few minutes for some quick questions and then save the last 15 for a detailed overview. Be able to save those. You can put your questions into the Q&A, and that's where Shelley will be tracking those and be able to ask those of the panelists as we go forward. Constance, on to you.
Good evening, everyone. And I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm actually very sorry that I'm taking an hour of your sunshine because we won't have many, many glorious days like today. But that is life when you're a condo director. You sacrifice a great deal. So they've said that I've been a condo director for a very long time, and very recently, over to the next slide, please, Shelley, we've seen a lot of changes to the Condominium Act and regulations. There have been a plethora of new forms, the PICs and the NOICs and all kinds of things that would drive property managers insane. But in fact, the director role and responsibilities have really stayed the same. And they are to manage and supervise the management and affairs of the corporation. We all have to remember as directors that we're in the service of others, and communication is going to be a key element of this. And everything that I'm going to be talking about is sort of building up to how your communications can be respected and how your actions will be transparent. So moving on, Shelley. You can successfully achieve your role, obviously, in partnership with your property manager, but bear in mind that the board of directors is absolutely responsible for governance. The property manager is clearly day-to-day. And Section 37(1) of the Act states that directors have to act honestly and in good faith. They have to exercise due diligence and care and skill as would a prudent person. And this is really expected of directors without compensation, and you deliver it with extreme patience. And I'm going to expand on the terms above because they're your building blocks to, as I said, communication and transparency. So moving on then to honesty and good faith. So first, be a signatory to the CCI Director's Code of Ethics. That's critical because many new directors don't know quite what's involved, and there are a whole series of do's and don'ts and behavioral cues that are very, very significant in terms of how to work with the team. Have in mind the best interests of all of the owners, not just your own unit when you're making a decision. You are really responsible for their quality of life and investment. Act when problems arise. Don't close your eyes to breaches by owners or other directors. If you do, it means you don't care. And obviously, a duty of care is where competence comes in. That's your duty of competence. You have to perform to a certain standard. You have to be careful and do a thorough review of all of the material you receive. And it's fine if you don't understand, because that gives you the opportunity to ask questions. For example, on the board where I serve, I receive electrical drawings and engineering drawings, and I don't even know in which direction to hold them for most of the time. But I will be guided through this by another board member and someone else. And the fact that you ask questions show that you care. Always show up, participate, discuss, and if you do, you're going to have an informed vote. You have to know what you are voting on and ultimately signing. And you have to, and if you fall short, you realize you could be held personally liable. So moving on then. In terms of diligence, always seek the advice of experts. And there's a long list of who is an expert. Here are some examples: lawyers, auditors, engineers, insurance brokers. You can't go to a friend who has a friend who's done something or other. Most of you already know this, but I'm also giving some basics because there could be some brand new directors who are listening in. Section 37(3) of the Act is really important because it does protect directors if they follow the advice of professionals consulted. The side of a building sadly could still fall down, but you did follow the advice of an engineer. So you might want to sue the engineer, but ultimately people can't sue you. Seek multiple bids when necessary. And establish with your property manager what is a reasonable line expenditure line by which the property manager can do her day-to-day business or his day-to-day business. And then the board is then seeking multiple bids after that. It could be $2,000, it could be $5,000, whatever makes sense for your site. Ask lots of questions and disagree before a decision is taken. And if you don't understand or ask a question, an owner will. And don't rush a big decision, because usually a big decision of lots of money, and frankly, it's that old management rule. If it's a problem, it's taken a long time to come about, and it's going to take at least half that time to solve. So if it's big money and it's complicated, don't rush it, don't force it. Keep asking questions. Next one. Reasonable prudence and skill. Keep your own notes, especially if you've had a lot of questions and you're getting some answers. And understand and respect the balance between a business necessary decision and one that is likely more popular or socially acceptable. And by that, I mean, every big decision is probably big money. And why do you have to take that decision? For example, are you taking it in light of the fact that you're saying, a lot of my owners are on fixed income. They won't like it if we spend so much money. And then of course we have owners who rent, And as renters or landlords, they really don't want anything that increases their costs vis-a-vis their income in terms of rent. And then you have those owners who really care about the upkeep and the future maintenance of their of the building. Really, if you look at it that way, it's 2 against 1. But what is the right decision? The right decision is the business necessary decision, and not that which is politically or a popular decision. As a board, you have to make tough decisions. And this is why it's always important to know what remains confidential. And you're going to have to work with all of the directors to reach consensus, because you may have some who joined because they are one-issue people, or they felt that the board was spending way too much money and they wanted to keep fees low. And you're going to have to work with them to reach consensus, okay? So a dissenting opinion and a vote is okay. You can record it in-camera minutes, because ultimately when minutes go out to vote to owners, you don't want dissension to be shown. Once the decision is taken by the board, even if you didn't support it, and that lack of support is in the in-camera minutes, you have to support it publicly once it's taken. It's a board decision. It's like that old verb, or term rather, cabinet solidarity. And then of course, continue your education with CCI courses, okay? So moving on. Clearly, a director's responsibility is to all of the owners. But not all owners respect this role or understand. We've talked about the fact that, or I have talked in the past, and I think Michael might talk about the fact that you always have a small percentage of owners, whether it's 2% or 5%, who really cause 100% of all your issues or problems, because they don't know why you're doing what you're doing. They don't understand your full legal responsibility, and they simply don't want you to spend money, or they want to do whatever they want. So what is it that you have to do? Clearly establishing a budget for the upcoming fiscal year and collecting the necessary funds, establishing an adequate reserve fund, and you have to review it often according to the schedule laid out in the Act. You have to pay all the bills with the manager. You have to maintain appropriate insurance, and for many of us that's becoming more and more difficult, and CCI is working on that. You have to maintain and repair the units and the common elements as required by the Act and set in the declaration, which means you actually have had to have read that brick, which is usually for most of us 1.5 inches. And then you have to call and hold information, budget, and annual meetings. And this is where we get to communication again. For another one, Shelley, please. So, yes. So in reference to owners and let's say the 5%, the 95%, everyone has purchased a condominium and that's their home. And some of them some owners interpret this according to the what I consider the American Constitution, which is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which really means it's my party and I can do what I want and I don't care what the board wants me to do. Then we have the good old Canadian point of view, which is peace, order, and good government. And this is where owners respect the declaration and the direction of the board. Mercifully, 95% of our owners tend to be the latter. Moving on, Shelley. So directors in partnership with the property manager are de facto the community police, and they're responsible, in fact, mandated to enforce peace, order, and good government. And it's the collective versus the individual. So how can this be achieved? Moving on. Communication, and I'm now going to elaborate on communication. So AGMs and budget meetings are the most important. I talk about information overload. Normally in an AGM package, for example, you would have requisite documents, you know, the auditor's report, the audit package, and the financials, and all kinds of now mandated forms that the condominium authority requires. And people sort of glaze over those. What I've intended, what has really worked for boards where I've been, where I am on, is that we supplement this, not with just a one-page president's report, but you know you're going to have everybody generally in a room or on Zoom these days. And the AGM portion is what happened in the past, but you've got them there and you know that they're going to ask questions on what's happening now and where are you going. So you have to be prepared for all of those. So what I found really works is that you have to anticipate all of the questions. You have to anticipate the questions on what you did and why you did it and how you did it and how much it cost. And then similarly, you have to anticipate all of the questions on what you're going to do, where you're going to do it, how much it's going to cost, and why are you doing it. And all of that is an additional package to the board. And if you send it out, of course, in the requisite time, people have a chance to read this. And in fact, they look forward to it. And you've missed something, they will write to the property manager and say, what about, and you will have heads up as to what else you have to answer. And so I've found that it is very, very useful to do that, to take that extra time. And again, you're going to be viewed as transparent, you're going to be viewed as efficient, and you're going to be viewed as knowledgeable and in control. Over and above large or events like that, of course, there are regular communiques on all matters like scheduled maintenance, relating to garbage or seasonal decorations and use of common elements. And then I have a point saying engage, it says complainants, but it could be requesters. And in the case of COVID, for example, we have found this to be very, very useful. We've had people who ask questions about, gee, when can we start using some element of the common facility or the party room? If you have one. And this came about, of course, once we moved to phase 3, or once there was talk about gyms possibly opening or things like that. And it's a huge burden on the part of the board and of course on the part of the property manager to do all of the research related to this solely, which of course we did. But what we did was we engaged the groups and say, fine, if you want to run line dancing, tell us how you propose to do it. Tell us what kind of protocol you propose to put in place, how many people, what social distancing you plan to have as part of this. And we engage them and have them part of the solution. And sometimes what they put forward won't work, but by their having put it forward, they understand why it won't work. You're just not the negative board saying, I can't do it, okay? And of course, COVID gave all of us boards the requirement to lead. We couldn't wait. We had to be on top of everything that could or couldn't be done because we're protecting, again, the safety of our environment. And of course, you've got your regular seasonal and/or newsletter. Moving on. So ultimately, the board is responsible for 100% for all management, protection, and control of the common elements. And as I said, we end up with quality of life, safety of owners, okay? Moving on, if we've practiced communication, as I said, and diligence and care, we end up with transparency, we have consistency and adherence and application of the Declaration of Rules. We have to adapt as necessary. We've acted as a cohesive and positive unit. And we end up providing financial security, short and long term for the condominium. And we've provided effective remedies dealing with deficiencies in rule enforcement. So in a nutshell, that's it. It's easily said, but not easily done. So thank you for taking the time to listen to my experience. I hope that I've been able to impart you with some wisdom, and I will now leave the floor to other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Constance, very much. I don't see any questions posted yet, but I'm sure everyone's writing some great notes. What I would like to ask everyone is, as we go through the other two presentations, is please, if you have questions for any of our panelists that you can't think of right now at the end of the presentation, write it down and we'll have an open forum at the end for a general Q&A as well. So at this point, I will turn it over to Michael.
Thank you so much. So my role here today is to talk about the property manager's perspective. And particularly, we are speaking about best practices in education and communication. Now, when I say best practices, this doesn't mean that this is what every single manager does. And it doesn't mean that it's the best for every situation. But a best practice is something that has been recognized as the industry as being a top tier way of doing it, as something that managers strive to do because it happens to work best. So in terms of owner education, because that's where we'll start today, we find that owners often don't understand what the condo manager's responsibilities are. They don't know. Do you rent my unit? Do you run the corporation? What do you do exactly? And speaking of not knowing about things, owners often don't know what their own responsibilities are. In many cases, we have owners who are first-time homebuyers or owners who move in from a single-family home. So they don't fully understand what the condominium ownership structure looks like and what their responsibilities are, specifically inside their unit, inside the common elements, all of those pieces. Which means that they quite often come to the condo manager for in-unit problems. The toilet isn't working, the sink isn't working, I have bugs, I have whatever, the window doesn't close properly. Some of these are condominium corporation issues, some of them are unit owner issues, and they often don't know the dividing line. And even sometimes for condo managers, we flip right to the declaration and reread straight from it who is responsible for what. So moving on to best practices, there are a few different tools, different methods of ways of thinking that help you arrive at different ways of educating owners. The first one I always mention is an online owner communication platform is a must. There are a few different types. My firm uses Condo Control Central. They're quite good. And really an online platform allows owners to have a repository of questions pre-answered online. And owners are educated that before emailing a property manager, just check online because you'll see a great answer to that question. Which means that you have to create a frequently asked questions document. They do require time investment, yes, absolutely. You have to spend some time writing these, but they can be very useful in terms of that they scale your thinking. In terms of speaking with one direct owner, you can write an FAQ document once and it lives online forever and you update it as things change. But every time an owner answers their own question, they are buying the corporation some time because the manager doesn't have to answer each question individually. Good things to do with them are, for example, to put them up in status certificates. That way, the lawyer of the unit owner, of the purchaser, will have a chance to review this, and the unit owner should read it right as they're buying the unit. They should know in advance the answers to their frequently asked questions. So, of course, it has to be posted online. An important fact here is to update these things frequently. If you write it once and it lives online forever, but you haven't updated it, it will quickly not become a source where owners can ask questions, or even worse, they go online and they get an outdated question answered. So you also have to educate owners to remind them to constantly check your FAQ, because they will forget that it exists there. But if you remind owners, it really serves its purpose. And the final point here is that instead of writing a poorly hammered out email response to an owner, invest the time to write a proper frequently asked questions document. And every time an owner has a question that's already been answered, you send them a link and you say, hey, the question's already been answered here, please have a look. So moving on to our next slide, we are going to talk about board member education. Just like owners arrive at the corporation not having the answers to a lot of questions and really not knowing what's happening, board members too arrive with little to no condominium experience. They are often unsure of their responsibilities and those of the manager. They fortunately come to us with a wide variety of experience. They could be in the trades, they can be in finance, they could be educators, medical professionals, or stay-at-home parents. So they have a lot of experience that is helpful, but they don't have specific board member education experience. And that's what we'll talk about on our next slide. So there are 3 steps listed on here, but there are actually 4. It looks like one of the points was missed, so I'll be able to go over that. So step number 1 is legally required. The board member has no option here. You have to take the CAO board member course. But not only are board members recommended to take this course, I actually frequently recommend that owners take this course, because it helps the owners understand exactly how this whole corporation structure works. The secret point number 2 is taking the CCI director's course. It's fully online this year, and this is really a beyond the basics. It begins exactly where the CAO board member course starts, and where it ends, and it continues from there. After that, CCI membership. So attending seminars like these is an absolutely excellent way of staying up to date of what's happening in the industry, because the professionals that you see on these particular panels do this all the time. We are professionals who spend our entire lives inside the condominium space. We're watching it. So learning from professionals like the ones you see on these panels. And finally, ongoing education from the manager. We see that the manager is not just someone who does things for the board. Yes, they do that, but they spend their entire lives in the condominium industry. It is their role to share their experience and their knowledge with board members. A board member may have encountered a leaky roof 0 times or maybe 1, while a property manager with years of experience could have seen this a whole host of times and knows what to expect. So really the manager has to be an educator here. So on our next slide, we're going to talk about some more best practices for educating board members. So as I mentioned in the last slide, the manager really has to be a conduit through which information flows. So they are the manager, they are the board's connection to the condominium world. The manager is the one who has relationships with all the different professionals, and their role is to take that expert advice and to give that advice to the board, but also help interpret that advice. View it through the lens of the property manager who may have seen this dozens and dozens of times in the past. So a manager who does not inform the board regarding pertinent interests is really failing to act in the corporation's best interest. So COVID-19 is a shining example of this, because managers are watching the industry, they're watching what's happening, and they need to share this information with the board, and they need to share this with the owners. So the manager is a conduit through which all this information flows. So let's talk about a different angle here. Best practices for managers. So we've covered board members, we've covered owners, and now we're getting deep into some practices for managers. As managers, we get a lot of inquiries all the time. A great way to answer these is through template emails. So it allows you to have fast and friendly responses. And I actually mean having pre-written emails that very eloquently and in detail answer specific questions that you see often. All you have to do is cut and paste. The owner's happy because they get a great answer to the question, and the manager's happy because that entire email took them 10 seconds to write. Even better than that, than having an owner wait for a reply from the manager, is to make use of these FAQ documents. All you need to do is you paste in one line item that says, thank you so much for the email. This question has been answered on the FAQ. Here's a link to it. After reading this, if you have any other questions, please let me know. And it saves you so much time, and it helps the owners get so much information much faster than you would normally. And finally, you need to make it clear what is and is not the corporation's responsibility. As bonus points, you can actually steer the owner in the direction of the appropriate resource. So instead of saying your sink is not part of the common elements, we can't fix that, that's like a C-level answer. It's not great. An A-level answer is explaining that it's not part of your common elements. Here are 3 contractors who you can call who can help you with this kind of work. The owner's happy because you can't fix it as the corporation, but also they know where they can get that problem fixed. So that's all I have to say about that specific point. So the last point I want to talk about here is harassment and aggressive owners. As managers, protecting our team members is our #1 priority. We have to ensure a happy and healthy and safe workplace for them, which means that there is no tolerance for harassing and aggressive owners. And it poses some grave legal risks to the corporation. And Mr. Davidson is going to talk about that a little more because it's just so important for corporations. How I recommend to do this is to always involve the senior manager. Your on-site team is always trained to answer questions on the ground as quickly as possible. But in cases of harassment and aggressive owners, senior managers have to be involved. The training that we recommend that managers provide is to actually train their on-site staff when and how to refuse service, when and how to close the door or ask someone to leave or hang up the phone. And these are things that a staff member who's working on-site has to understand that they are empowered to do, because that is one of the tools of making sure they have a safe workplace. But just as importantly, the senior manager has to be prepared to step in and set expectations for proper behavior with the offending owner or tenant or guest. So explaining what language isn't okay, the posture, how aggressive that owner is coming in, aggressive threats, yelling and gesturing. The manager has to be able to teach and to tell that owner what they're doing wrong. So on our next slide, we'll talk about the senior manager needs to lay out what was wrong in that particular owner's behavior and what needs to be changed to continue a relationship. It's clear that if the owner's yelling at you, you cannot continue that relationship. So the senior manager has to step in and tell that owner, what you're doing is not okay. You were yelling, you can't yell. You were threatening, you can't threaten. And for this reason, we recommend that written communication is best. Document everything, save videotapes, save security camera videos, save emails, and write incident reports, because this stuff is very important. And options if there is no immediate improvement. You can change your service level, which we're going to talk about in the next slide in a second. And by that, I mean that owner is not you can refuse that owner's service. You can involve your legal team, and you can involve the police. In some circumstances, restraining orders and charges are filed. So on our last slide, the senior manager can take over the relationship with an owner. I have, on occasion, gone to an owner and said, owner, you're being harassing. You are not allowed to talk to my team member anymore. You can only talk to me. And you can't send me 10 emails a week. You send me 1. And that way, I can give you a professional response, but also I'm insulating my on-site team member from the challenges of dealing with that owner. So these are some of the things we can do. We can talk about all day about how to deal psychologically with harassment and aggressive owners. But if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them now.
Okay. Thank you again, Michael. That's I know we had our pre-calls with this, and with all 3 of our speakers. This is very much a 30,000-foot view on all these topics. Each one of you could host your own webinar on the topics. I don't see any questions at the moment, but we will make it open to the end. I think the critical thing is here so far, as we've talked about, is to kind of bring it together. As Constance has talked about the role of the governance of the directors and where they need to focus on that, and Michael on the property management and knowing where the 2 roles plus legal team needs to bring that together. So on that note, I will move it over to Jim.
Jim, you're muted.
Thank you, Michael. Good evening, everyone. Delighted to be with you this evening. Shelley, please, to the first slide. So my opening message is that robust communication is always a great idea. And that's not an unusual message that you've heard that many times before. Strong communication keeps owners happy. And you've heard terrific comments from Constance and Michael on communication. I really enjoyed those presentations. I'm going to focus a little more on the 2% of owners who communicate unreasonably, and I'll be getting to that in a minute. Next slide, please, Shelley. So one of the early messages I wanted to give is that owners are already legally entitled to a huge amount of communication from the condominium corporation. And just quickly running down this list: budgets, financial statements, information certificates, status certificates if they wish, notices of future funding, those are what we used to call Form 15, insurance information, disclosure from director candidates, various notices. And Many condominium corporations, most now I would say, also issue newsletters and reports and other notices. And again, all of this is excellent. All of this communication is excellent. Next slide, please, Shelley. Owners can also ask for more information. They have the right to ask questions to the auditor. Owners are entitled to raise relevant matters for discussion at the AGM. And of course, we all know that owners are entitled to quite robust access to the corporation's records. So again, condominium owners are entitled to a lot of information, and that's a good thing. We all, of course, support this notion of good communication. Next slide, please, Shelley. But here are the questions that, the concerns, if I can put it that way, for the purposes of my talk. What about owners who demand a lot more communication? What about owners who are disrespectful in their dialogue? So in other words, what about the 2%? I think Constance mentioned 2 to 5%. I say 2%, it may be 5%, but anyway, we're talking about the same thing. Next slide, please, Shelley. So first of all, I want to stress that some information must not be disclosed. So what are we talking about? Information that is privileged. And this is essentially information listed in section 55 sub 4 of the Condominium Act. So in other words, records and information related to employees other than employment contracts, actual or contemplated litigation, or records related to other owners or other units. So owners don't get to see those things or get access to that information. Also, information that is protected by solicitor-client privilege, owners don't get to see. In addition, confidential board discussions aren't available to the owners. And in most cases, if you're a board member, you're on the board or manager, you're having the discussion, you'll know when it is confidential. It's a sort of information that's not to be made available to owners. And sometimes you might even discuss it and confirm on the board what is confidential and should not be disclosed. And also information that has to be held back in order to protect board solidarity. And you heard Constance talk about this. As much as possible, all directors are required to support the board decisions even when they disagree. And the disagreement, as much as possible, should not be disclosed to the owners. So you heard Constance talking about how if you need to record a disagreement in the minutes, that's fine, but it should be in a so-called in-camera portion, something that is not disclosed to the owners. Next slide, please, Shelley. So my next message, though, is that what about other information? What about owners who want more than they're strictly entitled to under the provisions of the Condominium Act? They continually ask for additional information. And my message is that owners actually don't have a legal right to more information beyond what I listed before. So if someone is asking for additional information, you can properly say, I'm sorry, we don't answer all of these extra questions from owners. And that's legally proper if you wanted to go in that direction. But what I wanted to stress is that you must be consistent in your treatment of owners. You can't answer Bob and not answer Mary. Now, most condominiums decide to answer most questions from owners as long as the questions are respectful and they're not excessive. So I heard Michael mention, 10 email messages or maybe extra long email messages a week. And then that compared to say 1 a week or 1 a month, let's say. And so if it's reasonable, if the communication is reasonable and respectful, what I see is that most condominium corporations want to respond. And I think that that makes good sense. And then you be consistent in that. Next slide, please, Shelley. But then owners' communications must be reasonable. And this, of course, is my main message. And what does it mean to be reasonable? It means respectful, not rude or threatening or excessive. And by excessive, I mean not unnecessarily frequent. So sometimes an owner's in a crisis. They've had a water escape damage. They've had some other issue that they're dealing with, a problem with a neighbor or something. That you might get some fairly frequent communications in those circumstances. But not excessive communication is communication that is unnecessarily frequent. So in other words, the communication cannot be violent or harassing. And this is required by the Condominium Act, Section 117, and also by the Occupational Health and Safety Act. Section 117 of the Condominium Act just says that unsafe or dangerous conditions are not permitted. And this harassment and violent communication falls into that category, and the courts have confirmed it. You'll see in a minute. Now, the Occupational Health and Safety Act applies to workers and workplaces, and condominium properties are workplaces for the condominium's management and staff. So occupational health and safety then is there to protect. Thanks, Shelley. And so now, what is violence and harassment? Continuing with this. Now, what I've given here are the definitions from the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And I want to draw your attention to the words in red that talk about harassment, meaning a course of vexatious comment or conduct against another person that is known or ought reasonably to be known to be unwelcome. So any rude, disrespectful, or abusive commentary is clearly unwanted. None of us wants that. And therefore, that is known or should be known to be harassment. Also, if someone sends you unreasonable communication, and if you say, please stop, your communication's excessive, your communication, we heard Michael talking about this, your communication is not respectful, please stop. And then if they continue, then there's no question, that's harassment because you've made it clear that it's unwelcome. Next slide, please, Shelley. Thanks, Shelley. So what have the courts said about harassment in the condominium setting? Here are, to me, the 3 leading cases in Ontario, and I'd just like to quickly review them with you. So the first one, OCSEC 671 versus Friend. You can see what I've written there. It dealt with unwarranted allegations of misconduct against the property manager. How often do we see these things against property managers and board members? Constant aggressive emails and complaints to condominium corporation personnel, insults, name calling, coarse language, and rudeness, as well as verbal abuse. And in that case, the court ordered those communications to stop. Next one, YCC 163 versus Robinson. Here, dealt with habitual email writing and frequent complaining, sending email messages virtually every day. So here you're getting into this excessive communication, I think of the word almost badgering of the manager, or it could be a board member. Insults, body shaming, name calling, and other types of coarse language and rudeness. So again, the court ordered in that case that these communications stop. The next one, Diamantopoulos versus MTCC 594. I've always thought this case is really interesting because it says condominium corporations can properly insist that communications only be in writing and only to management, not directly to board members. So you can properly ask, first of all, you can ask all owners, if you wish, to communicate only in writing to the manager. Board members, I know many are willing, but they don't have to be, while they're out walking their dog, interrupted by an owner with all sorts of questions or concerns. You can ask that kind of thing not happen to board members. And if you've got a harassing owner, let's say you don't have the policy for all owners, but if you have a harassing owner, you can say that harassing owner will only communicate reasonably and in writing to the manager. And you heard Michael talk about the possibility that it would be in writing to a particular manager only, or verbal communication only to a particular manager, whatever you think is best for the particular situation. Next slide, please, Shelley. So now, what are the remedies? How do you deal with a harassing owner? Ultimately, as I've shown, to me, the ultimate remedy is to go to court. There are other things you can do. Michael mentioned some of them. You can get special orders through criminal processes in order to control someone's movements and conduct. But to me, the ultimate remedy is to go to court in most cases under the Condominium Act, under Section 134, but essentially for a violation of Section 117 of the Act. And as I said previously, we've seen the two cases from the previous slide. But that's the ultimate remedy. It is, to me, a last resort. You want to see if there's any way that you can work with the owner and try to bring the communication into a sensible arrangement. So you could send a letter or a lawyer's letter to explain how communications should change and cordially requesting compliance. And you could say, please make sure your communications are cordial and respectful. These are legal obligations. You can, when we write to owners about these things, we explain that these are legal obligations, requirements under the Condominium Act and the Occupational Health and Safety Act. In some cases, you can be more forceful. You can say this communication has to stop. As I said before, you can explain that responses maybe won't be provided except in an emergency or as required by the Condominium Act. So you can say you will receive the information only when all owners receive the information. But again, I'm going to stress you have to be consistent about that. And so you have to be careful about when you can take that approach with one owner and not with others. Also, you could insist that communications only be in writing and only to management, as we saw in the Diamantopoulos case. But then I have the final note on this slide. You can see what about the political consequences of asking for these sorts of restrictions or special arrangements. A harassing owner will sometimes complain to other owners, or maybe to all owners, that the board lacks transparency. The board is not open. The board is not answering questions. So you may have to manage that sort of fallout. But in my experience, those sorts of complaints about lack of transparency won't usually gain much traction among other owners if you have good, robust communication as a general practice of the sort that we heard described by Constance in particular during her talk, and Michael as well. Okay, my final slide, Shelley. What are your duties when it comes to violence and harassment? I thought I would quickly go through these as a way to wrap up. Overall, by you, I mean a condominium corporation, the board working with management. You have a duty to take reasonable steps to protect all of your workers, including management and staff, directors and officers as well, owners, residents, and guests. You have a duty to protect them, take reasonable steps to protect them from violence and harassment. Here you'll see I've made reference to the Wilicki case, where a court said that a cooperative board, a co-op board, had a duty to investigate and try to stop even anonymous offensive postings in the building. So we had an unidentified person in the building posting things that were in some ways violations of human rights in their offensive commentary about primarily members on the board, but others in the community as well. And the court said the board had a duty to take reasonable steps to try to stop those. And here the board made lots of efforts, but the court said the board had to go further. And so it gives you an idea of what the courts expect from boards dealing with this sort of conduct in the community. And I think the same applies to condominiums. The same concept that we see in the Wilicki case applies to condominium board members. Two final notes I have there If you have employees, you must have a workplace violence and harassment policy. Some of those are available online. They're pretty good pro forma templates available for workplace violence and harassment policies. I also recommend a violence and harassment rule applying to everyone on the property, not just workers. So it goes on to also apply specifically to non-workers. And I like the idea of a rule because it supplements or it goes beyond what you see in Section 117 of the Condominium Act. The rule can define violence and harassment, and basically our template just borrows from the definitions in the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And then this adds more detail, makes gives owners a bit better understanding of what they're dealing with in terms of what is prohibited. So that's, to me, violence and harassment rule, good idea for every condominium. And so that's it. Shelley, thanks very much. Mike, back to you, I guess.
Thank you very much, Jim. And again, these are all great presentations in great detail, and each one of them could go on with their own webinar. We have one comment and a question here. The first comment is, and it was a great point made by one of our attendees, we often talk about managers requiring the appropriate respect and courtesy. This party concurs to that, but also states it's important to remember that the equation works both ways, and the manager cannot treat the owner with lack of respect or courtesy. That's a great avenue, and the reason we one of these this webinar precipitated was because of this scenario. Many owners will and directors and boards will have remedies in place when they feel maybe a property manager has overstepped or been informal, or there is an employee relationship there. What's interesting is many owners don't realize that the board manages the property management role, but all the owners maintain the employee relationship. So it's not like a buffet style. You don't get to choose that they have an employee relationship to get action done and then choose to not treat them with workplace respect. So this party is absolutely correct. We need to make sure that the property managers are held accountable and coached and assisted. But that plays the other way. So every owner, whether it's a 20-unit condo or a 400-unit condo, each owner has an employee-employee relationship, and that workplace respect always starts at the employer state first. The second one, and this actually goes to all three of you, and I think it's a timely question. It's interesting, and it's loaded. So we'll start with Constance, and I'd like to get each one of yours first blush response. If an owner requests a consultant's report, for example, say an elevator consultant or those easy to read engineer reports, or are they entitled to receive that? Constance, what are your thoughts?
I would say yes, but if something is very, very large and cumbersome, it's something that we would likely charge them for. It's difficult. What if it's a progress report and it wouldn't make any sense? So what we would say, for example, is there is no conclusion to this report. It's a preliminary study. And when we have an outcome, we will share it with you. So it really depends.
Perfect. So
that's what I would say.
And I was going to say, so instead of either saying no, communicate with them what you can in the progress on where it's sitting.
Exactly.
Perfect.
Or this is something that we're seeking bids on. This is one of many. It's not appropriate to share at this point, because then it becomes a document that they're going to want to make a decision on, and it's not their job to make a decision on it. They elected you to do that.
Exactly.
What I can add here is I would ask why they're looking for this type of information. So a good example my brother gave me, who's an architect, says, I asked him this, should I read the building code? And his response to it is no, because you are going to hurt yourself. And by that, he means that it is a very large and very complicated document. And you could be in one section of the document, but really think you're in another section, and what you're reading only applies to daycare centers. So what he recommends is you should talk to a professional who can interpret that building code for you. So the same thing applies here. Why does the owner want that information? And if you give them that information, it may be far too technical for the average owner to read, and they should have either an engineer or a property manager or a lawyer help them understand that document. So I'd really try to investigate why they're looking for it.
And Jim, what are your thoughts?
Okay, well, my answer to the question is, are they entitled to that kind of consulting report is not always. That's my answer. So if the document relates to actual or contemplated litigation, and we can get into a debate about what those words actually mean, but if it relates to actual or contemplated litigation, they may not be entitled to it. If it is solicitor-client privileged, so in other words, if it's a lawyer's report or the lawyer is the consultant, they might not be entitled to see it. If it's a draft or it has not yet been accepted by the board, and this was something I think Constance was referring to, that might not yet have fallen into the records of the corporation. So it might not yet be something that the owner would be entitled to. And it could be contrary to the interests of the corporation to provide it as well. For instance, if it's still in a bidding process, there may be a confidentiality duty or something like that. That means that it must be withheld. If it relates to another unit, there might be a reason not to. So for instance, if one owner is having a particular problem, maybe a dispute with a condominium corporation gets a report related to that one unit, the foundation of that unit, or why is it cracking, et cetera, or how are we dealing with a particular problem in relation to another unit, and often it would be a common element issue, but if it's a unit issue specific to one unit, they might not be entitled to it. So my answer is in many cases, they may well be entitled to it, but not always.
Yeah, it depends.
Depends, exactly.
And that's key. So it's ask questions and share what you can that's reasonable under the circumstances. And again, this goes back, I think Consul to it. Many owners like to be armchair directors. They want to run the board from their armchair, but not participate. They may have read a Google review of a law report and they give Jim advice, or Michael, they may have taken the CAO course and said, hey, I'm now a PM. It's about engaging them, but being fair. On that topic, want to do two quick announcements. One, we have our virtual annual general meeting for CCI coming up. So it's coming up Wednesday, October 21st, 7 p.m. And we're excited because we are looking for new board members. We have a few board members who are changing their role within CCI, a few who stepped back from active directorship. So if you haven't already put your name forward or think somebody in your condo is, or a PM or a professional, please get involved. We've got Michael, we've got Jim, we've got Constance. Everybody has an opportunity to be participating in CCIEO. And one of the great ways is being a director. You can sign up on the website. If you're not sure, send us an email and we're happy to get you that link as well. Shelley, if I get you to go to the next slide for a moment. And of course, what would we be if we didn't promote our own courses? We have our virtual Eastern Ontario Directors course coming up in Beyond the Basics. So every Thursday between November 5th to the 7th, starting every Thursday evening in November between 5 to 7, we'll be doing a virtual Beyond the Basics 4-part series. So looking forward to having you sign up for that. You can do that on the website again. It's all detailed out there what the 4 parts are, and we've found that everyone has told us this is a great expansion and more detailed than the CEO's one. So we're looking forward to have people sign up for that. Again, registration's on the website. And the last one, shall I get the last slide there? And as always, we are looking for feedback. We are only as good as the information we provide our members. We want to get your feedback on this survey and any other parts of CCIO. So please, you'll get a survey after this event and let us know how we can improve, what we've done great, and how we can attract more members to join these webinars. For those of you who attended, thank you very much. To Constance, thank you for taking the time. We appreciate you coming in as a director and giving your perspective and sharing with them. Michael, thank you for coming in as a PM. Having somebody from our Kingston area is always great to have and to bring the benefit of a large chapter. So thank you for that. And Jim, I'd like to say thank you again. Looking forward to having you for the next 36 years as part of CCIO. Thank you again to all attendees, to Shelley for keeping me on track. That's been appreciative. Before we go, I see one more question. I'm going to throw it out there. Owners are not required to say why they're asking for particular information records. Has there been any challenge about the certification owners are required to sign with record requests for their own benefit and interest? Flip a coin. Who wants that one? Jim, Michael, or Costas?
It's a Jim.
Yeah, that has not changed, and there's been no movement on that. That's been a point of particular controversy. The law on it is that they aren't able, or they can't be required to ask to say why they want the record. But if it is obvious for other reasons, if there's other evidence to show that their reason is improper, or in other words, that their certification is inaccurate, then the condominium corporation could withhold the record. But again, the owner can't be asked. The owner can't be asked. The evidence of it has to be elsewhere. And so that's still the way, that's the law that as it is, as far as I know. I haven't seen anything new on that recently. So
it goes back to what all three of you were saying is, I mean, assume the owner is asking because they want to be informed. And unless contrary evidence is given, support them where you can in the context under the acts and the parameters of the request.
Yeah, if you happen to learn that they want some record like the list of owners so that they can knock on their doors and sell things to them, that might then be improper. But you can't ask them what their reason is.
That's fair and reasonable.
Yeah.
So again, thank you everybody. It was a great information-packed hour. I have lots of notes as always. Have a great Wednesday evening all. Thank you again.
Thanks a lot. Thanks everyone.